Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. This afternoon. I'm already thinking it's nighttime. I'm Margie Longoria. I welcome to the 7th annual Border Book Bash, celebrating teens and tweens of the Rio Grande Valley. I'm really excited. This is our last panel of the day, and I got caught up with the last panel that I went over time. So this panel is very, very important and very close to my heart. It's why we need culturally relevant literature. Why we need it in schools, why we need it in libraries, why we need it in life. And I've invited here some amazing writers and teachers to kind of talk about this topic. And I'm real excited to start. So I'm going to ask you guys to just introduce yourselves, tell us where you're tuning in from, and a little bit about the books you've written. So let's go. Anybody can start. I guess we can start with Danny.
All right. So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Good Lord. I'm still on. It's holiday mode for me. So one of my books is called You Know What I'm Saying. And I'm from the Rio Grande Valley. So I was born in Houston, but we moved to way, way deep South Texas on the borderlands when I was about right before kinder. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'm an English teacher. I've been teaching high school English for about 17 years. And I'm also a dual enrollment instructor for South Texas College, teaching English literature and British literature, American literature, that sort of thing.
Okay, Dr. Carmona?
Yes, so I'll go ahead. My name is Christopher Carmona. I'm coming in from San Antonio, originally from the Valley and from down in Texas. The family's been there for a very, very long time. And the books that I guess I'm talking about or promoting it's called Adelincha, the Ghost Ranger of the Rio Grande Valley, and currently I'm working on the 3rd volume.
Sergio?
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Sergio Troncoso. I'm coming to you from El Paso, Texas, the best place for Mexican food in Texas. And si me picas, te pico. And but I'm usually in New York and Connecticut. I teach at Yale University, but I grew up here in Isleta, and I'm calling you from my brother's house. So I'm back home for the holidays, and I'm talking about Nobody's Pilgrims, which is my latest novel. It's an adventure story that begins in El Paso about a Chicano and a undocumented immigrant, and then a poor white girl that they meet, and they go across country in sort of an adventurous way. And I'm really thrilled to be here. I actually admire some of the writers that are here. So it's very exciting to meet them.
Dr. Gonzales?
Hi, everybody. Trinidad Gonzales. I'm a history and Mexican American studies instructor at South Texas College. I'm coming from my office in my home right now as we're on break. I haven't written a book, but I've written op-eds, essays, of course, the essay in Living Beyond Borders, Growing Up Mexican in America. And that's the sort of work I do. I really focus in on advocacy as well concerning Mexican American studies.
And that's why this little group is so important. And so that's why I wanted to do it. And I asked you all to be in this group because of everything that you guys do for Mexican American studies and the literature for it. Okay. So I wanted a group of educators who are also writers to talk about why it's so important to have culturally relevant literature in the world today. So I want to jump right in and ask, what was your experience in school with culturally relevant literature in high school and like growing up? What were some of your experiences? If you had any, that's kind of like what we want to talk about. So anybody?
I mean, I grew up Generation X, and so I was in high school in the 80s. I mean, I didn't get to know anything. I never heard of Gloria Anzaldúa, even though she's from my part of the world in deep South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. I never heard of her until late in my college career, even as an English major. In high school, I mean, we read maybe one or two poets from Latin America, not even from Mexico. Like it was from like Argentina or something like that, which is, like Burgos and stuff, and Gabriela Mistral maybe. I never heard of Neruda or anything like that. And so we were just, spoon fed, force fed, just the dead white guys, I love Shakespeare, but we just heard, from the dead white writers in high school. That was my experience. I hardly ever heard anything that was much culturally relevant. Thank God we did hear it from the Harlem Renaissance, which were very influential in my writing, some of those poets especially. Other than that, there were no Asians, Native Americans, not even a mention. Table of contents, there might have been one tiny mention in there, but we were never exposed to anything like that, at least in the late 80s in high school. So it was just barely in college that I kind of got a little bit of taste of anything that was culturally relevant, especially for myself as a Chicano, Hispanic, Latino. As far as anything like that, it was very, very little mention of anything like that.
Yeah, so I guess I'll follow up. We'll go in the same order we started. I'm in the same boat as Daniel here. The only thing I got exposed to in school wasn't even part of a regular class. It was like a UIL reading thing, and I read Bless Me Ultima in my senior year in high school, but it wasn't on any of the curriculum, right? And that was it wasn't really until college that I started to get more Latino literature and things of that nature, but there really wasn't any at all. And so, I was exposed to the same type of stuff that Daniel was, right? We all had the same curriculum growing up during that time. But it does make a difference, though, when you see it. And, if it was, talk about this, like this, having that kind of representation really matters. And not having it, I got it very late. Anzaldúa, I wasn't really exposed to until I was in graduate school, like many, many years later.
So just to chime in, I don't want to repeat what people said, but I had this very similar experience in El Paso, where in high school, really, you weren't taught, Rudy Anaya, or you weren't taught Anzaldúa, and all of this stuff I learned in college. I really had to travel thousands of miles to Harvard, which is where I went to school, to learn about Mexico, to learn about, I studied with John Womack, who's a preeminent writer in English, by the way, on Mexico. He was a Marxist scholar and chairman of the history department, and others, to learn about the history of Mexico in El Paso, and which later, of course, comes out through David Romo's book, Ringside Seat to a Revolution. But all of these influences were absent in high school. And so one of the things I wanted to add is that it's been my project, frankly, for the last 20 years to educate myself. I saw myself as, brown against a white background for the very first time when I was in Cambridge. And people said, you don't act like a minority. And I said, well, what the hell does that mean? And, I was not a minority in El Paso. As you know, Mexicanos have been the majority for generations in El Paso. And so I took it upon myself to educate myself about Mexico, about Chihuahua, about the Mexican Revolution, about Rudy Anaya and Anzaldúa, and the history as well as the literature. But I had to really travel thousands of miles away to realize what was missing. What was this huge gap that was missing that I did not get in Texas, and that was in many ways prohibited.
Echoing very much what everyone else said, one poet I did read, and I can't remember what anthology was Gary Soto. Mm-hmm. So one of his poems was included in an anthology we had in one of my English classes, but I can't remember what it was. Now, my older brother gave me a copy to read when I was in high school, Pocho, which is a historical novel, written in the 50s. So that I read in high school, but I didn't read because it was assigned in the curriculum or in the classes. I read that as my brother was in college. He's 6 years older than me. He was in college, and he had that book. And then I ended up reading a lot of Vidal's other works when I was at Pan Am, because there was a certain part of the library I knew where all the Chicano literature was, and that's when I discovered all the other sorts of books he had written, plus other writers as well. And so I started in college devouring that sort of literature, because even in college, I wasn't being assigned Chicano literature at Pan Am University of Texas Pan American. when I was there. So even at my college level, I was seeking out those kinds of works, and I knew where in the library to find it on my own, and I'd sit there and just start reading books.
When I was looking for authors for my for the anthology that I did, I thought about Gary Soto, because you mentioned Gary Soto, because I loved his little, like, his picture. I liked his books. Like, I read them with my 8th graders and stuff. So I Googled him, right? And I was like, okay, and it had a phone number, like, call this number. So I called it thinking it was going to be like an agent. It was Gary Soto. It was him. Like, he answered the phone, and he was like, so I was like, I felt like, wait a minute. So I was telling him about it, and he was like, he wasn't really doing anything at the time. And he was like, I can't commit to it because I don't know if I will do it, if I can do it, whatever. But he was like, I just wish you luck with your project and whatever. But I thought it was so funny because his number, I just called him and he answered the phone. It's like, I thought that was super cool because he was very just like down to earth and stuff. Mm-hmm. And he's also like, we consider him one of the pioneers of the Chicano genre. So mm-hmm. That was cool. Okay, so now I want to talk about adolescence and why, because it's the same thing with me. I didn't read anything about Chicano literature until I got to college. I think I took a class. It was a feminist class, and I loved it. That's where I learned about Gloria Anzaldúa, and because I had never even, growing up as a reader, I never even realized that I was like, because I was I read everything, and I didn't really I read and I related to the characters, like the different things in the characters for different reasons. But it didn't even dawn on me until later that I didn't identify with these characters with my background. It wasn't until I taught 8th grade where my students were smarter than I was. And they were asking me, where are all the Mexican characters? Where are the Mexican writers? And I thought to myself, like, you're right. Where are they? Like, we had Sandra Cisneros. I know Renee Saldana had a book out at the time that I was teaching. So I read that book with my kids and they loved it because it was set here in Mission and they were able to relate. And I was like, where are all these books? And it's so important because the kids I taught, they were a rough bunch of kids. You know, they weren't your typical. It took a lot for me to get them to want to read a book. And just the fact that they did sit down and read the book and love the books that I picked for them meant a lot to me because that's what I wanted. That's what you want as a teacher, as a librarian, for these kids to love reading. And it was books like that they wanted to read that we couldn't find and I couldn't find. And I remember, so growing up, you know, these kids, it's so important for kids to see themselves in books, right? It's so important for them because it shapes them. So why do you feel this kind of literature is important for young people? And how do we get more of it out there to our kids?
Mm. Yeah, Daniel.
I wouldn't. Well, I mean, just even the fact, right, that the questions being asked in English, you know, just kind of is part of the answer, right? I mean, we have this, you know, very Eurocentric mentality, you know, in the U.S. And you know, there's kids, let's say, and I say kids, but generations upon generations for hundreds of years of people, let's say, in Africa, you know, in Australia, in the New World, all over the place, in Asia, that, you know, had their culture, you know, almost erased completely, sometimes successfully, by you know, white missionaries. White missionaries didn't just come to the Americas, right, but they went to Africa and etc. And they suppressed languages, they suppressed mythology, they suppressed complete ways of storytelling. And so again, the fact that the questions even asked right in American English, standard American English, it kind of is part of the, you know, the answer is that there's a huge need, right? We have in this country 19% Hispanic, according to the latest census, but we're the only community, the Latino community in the U.S., who sort of somewhat goes out of their way to suppress the census count, you know, self-suppress. In other words, we don't self-report the fact that we are existing here because of our proximity to Mexico. There is some, you know, illegal immigration, quote unquote, not just from Mexico, but just, you know, we have people from all over, from the Middle East, from China, and yes, from Latin America that come through. So there's an undercount in the census. And so we're already underrepresented, even even self-regulated, not counting that. And so we're 19% of the population in the U.S., the quote-unquote highest minority group or largest minority group now in the U.S. And I think it's a question of power, right? We want to empower our kids, our youth, to part of that empowerment, is to see themselves in literature. And we're living in a woke culture that on one extreme, we have the racist, right? Like Martin Luther King mentioned, in literature Birmingham jail. I understand the people that hate me, but then we have the people that say they support us, and they're so woke, and they say, "Oh, I'm colorblind." Like, no, we don't need you to be colorblind. Like, we need you to see our brown skin, to embrace it, to teach it. And so for young people, it's so important, I think, to see themselves in literature. Young people, people of all ages, right? But especially for our youth, since they're coming of age, right? We're living in a society where we're even for myself as a Hispanic, I want to see some Spanish works, but my body is also craving the Native Americanness, that I have very little been exposed to, both from the Mexican side as well as the Native American U.S. side. And so there's a lot of need, I think, for us to see ourselves, for young people especially, to find themselves in books, not just on book covers, but in the content where there's not just that, token Black friend or token Hispanic friend or token stereotypical made in a movie, in a book, etc. So there's a huge need for relevancy. Thank
you. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Trini.
You could go ahead and go, Chris, and then I'll go.
All right. So what I was going to say is that I was thinking about the question you just asked, but also the question you asked before. One book that I did grow up with, or was in the library in school, was Stories That Must Not Die. And I remember the Stories That Must Not Die, but what I remember about reading that is, they're telling all the folklores like La Llorona and all these different things. But the way the book is written, it wasn't couched as a like Chicano or, Latino work. It was just the stories of, growing up, that we've heard growing up. So, and with something like that was the only book that I remember in the libraries that had that kind of representation in a school library at the time when I was growing up. But what I was going to say is that representation matters. We're in the state of Texas, as to kind of compare what Daniel was saying. It's 53% Latino student population, 73.5% students of color in Texas. And we do not have a curriculum that reflects that. And that goes to one of the roots of the problem is that's well over a majority of the student body are students of color. And yet we're not, being really addressed in that. And of course, looking at representation as something that very much matters in a leading role, right? In books, in movies, in television is a huge thing. Because it's something we've never really had before, and don't really and also the I guess the flip side of that is when we are represented, and we're represented heavily, is in the villain role, the antagonistic role, or even stuff like they have this television show Mayans, which is about biker gang, Chicano biker gang, so they're criminals, so they're always seen in these lights rather than we have positive influences, or and so those are very few and far between. And so when you're getting that, and then you're growing up with that, psychologically that has an effect on who, like, basically what your options are growing up, what the path is. And then of course you have a lot of these, especially when I was in school, that the paths for us were pretty much limited to technical schools and things like that. College was not really pushed as much, and going to get a higher education degree was not a priority for a lot of the counselors in school. And so that, I think, is all coupled together when we start to think about our representation, why we need not just representation but positive representation and these books for the kids, so students can see that. and that will have a positive effect. I'm sure of it.
I'd like to add a nuance to your question, Margie. So I read Pocho, and I could identify it and not identify with it because the main character is in California, right? And it just like, oh, okay, see aspects here, I don't see aspects here. So one things I would like to talk about is how then the local community's literary production is important as well, because they'll bring in aspects of the community within their literature that you may not get from somebody writing about Mexicanos in California or New Mexico or El Paso, for instance, because I grew up in the Valley. So first, I would like to say presente for Rolando Hinojosa Smith, who passed away this year. When I read his book, The Valley, that's when I was like, oh, yeah, right. I can identify with the world he created within his series books. But I didn't get that until college, right? And of course, I read Medico Paredes with his pistol in his hand in college as well, and I could identify with that. And then I signed for many years George Washington Gomez, which was a Medico Paredes book that he wrote during the 30s. And the students hated it because they didn't like the names. They said, these are old names. Nobody names their kids anymore, these names, right? But then they were so angry. I mean, it was just such a visceral anger when they came to class after they finished reading the book, and they were just upset with the character. But they got into it as they went through it, right? It's about the Valley, right? And we're in the Valley, and they're reading about the Valley, so they can identify with the landmarks and what's being done in the book and history of the book. So I think also adding, local literary production as part of the curriculum as an enhancement. Not that you shouldn't read about other communities in the rest of the world, right? Sandra Cisneros talks about Chicago, for instance. But really getting that local flavor into what you're reading, I think adds a lot more to it as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, specific battles to, make sure that we have diverse literature on our bookshelf. Because all of this, eventually comes down to brass tacks. How do you get more books? How do you get more readers? How do you get the people assigning that readership being educated about our very diverse community? And so for me, I just finished, for example, one of the ways I tried to address that issue of increasing representation in our work is through the organization that defines the Texas canon, the Texas Institute of Letters. I just finished being president in April, and I'm proud to say we inducted more Chicanos, more African Americans, more women than ever before. And let me tell you, and of course, I wasn't the only one. I was really building on people like Kip Stratton, who was the president maybe 6 years ago, Steve Davis, and then Carmen Tafoya, and then me. So we were all on this roll to stop making it an old, basically white guys from Austin and Dallas. And we succeeded. And in my year, the president gets to appoint 12 different committees, 3 judges each. I appointed, and you can ask Carmen this, I appointed more women, more Chicanas as chairman than Carmen did. And these are the people running the committees that assign the awards, that if you win this award and you tell all you have to do is look at our list, it's probably the most diverse award-winning list produced in the Texas Institute of Letters. But this is all about battles. This is all about not just saying I want to change things, but when you get a chance to run an organization, that you do it well, porque como yo les dije en español, maybe I'm going to be a little crude here. When you're successful, when you have record numbers joining and entering your contest, when you hit records, which I did because I was very aggressive in fundraising, se callan el hocico. The white guys who ran the organization in the 70s and 80s, and who is the Sergio, running, they just shut up because we are going way beyond what anything they did. So it is not just let's change things, but when you're put in places of responsibility to increase the power of our community so they can choose culturally relevant literature and award it for what it should be. The anthology you're looking behind my head here, Nepantla Familias, I created it simply because, Antaldúa was a very big influence on my life. But I also asked all of these writers, from Sandra Cisneros and Alex Espinosa, Rigoberto Gonzalez, I was very kind of tough on them. I said, don't send me your old work. I want new work for this collection, something you have not written, something that speaks to my children, the 20 and 30-year-old, not the old guys. I want new work. And Helena Viramontes is in it, etc. And so I'm really proud, and I'm glad that I think we're now in our third printing on this anthology, that it's hitting its stride, and it really does matter. But I also think we can't be thinking of Chicano literature or Mexican American literature is this, because it is morphing. And I'll give you a little, a couple of data points. First, of course, in Connecticut, they say, hay Chicanos in Connecticut? You're damn straight. Hay Chicanos in Boston? They're everywhere. And so this idea that we should just stick with the border, I think we should be conquering places like Kansas, like Concord, Massachusetts, like, places where there are no traditional Chicanos. That, I think, the first point, because I see them, I see them in Kent, Connecticut, where I live. The most popular restaurant is run by a familia and owns it from Oaxaca. And so, and they're Mexicanos in the middle of rapidly changing Connecticut. So the reason I point this out is because our readership is changing. I'll give you one last little data point, and then I'll shut up. At UTEP, okay, University of Texas at El Paso, that has 85% Mexican American population, the number one Hispanic serving institution in the country, okay? Something very remarkable happened a few years ago. Every year, the entering class, the freshman class, it was always 70, 80, 60% first generation getting to college. For the first time about 2 or 3 years ago, it dipped below. It's now 48, 45%. And so they studied these statistics, and what's happening? The Mexican-American parents who graduated from UTEP are now sending their kids to UTEP. Okay, so it's a very different, and evolving readership. It's true, and I did the Pisca, by the way. I did the Pisca, on the border when I was small. But now the battles are, what kind of racism do you face if you're in Kent, Connecticut, or if you're in the Ivy League, or if you're a lawyer in Kansas City? And it's a sort of a different level of the story, and it doesn't mean that you don't have poor people coming across the border, but like a more complex story is, how about all these McAllen men voting for goddamn Trump, and like what's happening there? We have to tell the complex story, right, of what's happening within our community, even if it's critical, and I believe in that. I believe you tell it the way it is, not just to prettify it, because as you know, this is a phenomenon that definitely happened in McAllen. The question is this sort of something temporary, or is this something that's deeply rooted and something that's going to change for the worse how a segment of our community votes? So well, I don't want to be too much of a bomb thrower, but I'm ready. So.
Well, if you're talking about the complexities of belief systems amongst Mexicanos, and in this case, McAllen or South Texas, it's always existed, right?
Right.
You've had conservatives, liberals, anarchists, whatever stripe, political stripe, because it's a community that's an intellectual community, and it's always been an intellectual community. It's just that it's never been recognized by the mainstream institutions of the United States, or because of language differences, right? So there's been a dismissal of this political complexity the community has. So people being surprised that there's Trump voters clearly are not keeping up with the complexity and the history of the community that's always existed there, right? The Democrat Party in the 60s, 70s, 50s, well, so on, had a conservative wing and a liberal wing. And the Valley voted conservative sometimes for the Democrat Party and sometimes liberal. They're all Democrats, but you got to contextualize what the Democrat Party was in those time periods where it was split.
Right.
So there's a continuity of that conservatism there.
Can I mention a little bit of news? It's not news yet, but this is like how I'm really trying to change places like the Texas Institute of Letters. I am negotiating at the moment to possibly have an award, and I got the funder already who wants to do this, to award a poetry award of original work written from a Tejano in Spanish. Not translated, but a Tejano writer, a Texas writer, writing originally in Spanish. It would be the first award that the TIL has done of its kind. It would really, right, understand that there's a whole segment of our community that is primarily writing in Spanish, and it had been ignored. And so, it's not quite done, but that's what the funder wants to do. That's what certainly I want to do. And it's about changing and expanding the canon, understanding that great literature doesn't, in fact, has come from our community for generations. It's just been ignored.
Right. You were talking about is there Mexicans in Connecticut? Chini writes an essay in our anthology, Living Beyond Borders. Are there Mexicans in Washington? The Mexicans in Texas. And I remember whenever I wanted to do this anthology, I was thinking of the writers that I wanted in this book. I wanted, it's called Living Beyond Borders, but the title, it's a metaphorical border. It doesn't necessarily, because people think that Mexicans are only along the Texas border or along the California border. No, we're everywhere. Like you said, we're all over the country. And I'm very proud to say we have I think there's 7 or 8 of us from the Valley in this anthology. But everyone else, like Francisco Stork lives in Boston. Angela lives in Kansas. Like, I made sure to include the whole country because Mexicans live from sea to shining sea in the United States, and people don't realize that. And that's why, like when you said that, there's Mexicans, it reminded me of Chini's essay, because people are so ignorant that they don't realize we're the biggest minority group, like Danny said, like, we're everywhere and we're not being seen that way. So thank you for that. You guys are I feel you guys are amazing, like with your thoughts and stuff. So let me talk about the current climate that we live in. It's very important that we continue to write and we continue to produce these stories, our culturally relevant literature stories. And then what Sergio's doing, just creating more opportunities for people of color as far as literature is concerned, because a lot of times people feel that we can't write. Whenever I remember Javi Garza said it the best one time. He goes, Gloria Anzaldua's from here. She's from the Rio Grande Valley. She's from Edinburgh, Texas, like me. She went to Edinburgh High School. I think she was a valedictorian of Edinburgh High School. And I went to Edinburgh High School, and I didn't know that. Nobody ever told me that she was from Edinburgh High School. Like, why is Edinburgh High School not named Gloria Anzaldúa High School? So that's what I think it's so important. Like, what are your thoughts on how do we continue this fight to make sure that our voices are still amplified in this community where everybody wants to kind of suppress us or villainize us?
The short answer is what Sergio said, right? Inserting ourselves into positions of authority within the structural apparatus of education or academic academies and things like that. I mean, this is the work that me and Chris have done for, how long have we been doing this now, Chris? 10 years? I don't know how long we've been fighting for.
Yeah, we've been doing this about 10 years now. So,
getting the Mexican American Studies course for high school, the first in the nation to do that in Texas was a struggle. It's about 6 years, I think, of doing that. Now we have African American studies in high school, and we're working on the Asian American and American Indian Indigenous Studies course as well. So once you create those classes, then you could create the sorts of demands for that sort of literary production within those classes. And there's works to do a Mexican American Studies lit class as well, right? So those are structural changes that are very important because the way I got Pocho was through my brother, right? It wasn't assigned to me in the class other than Soto's poetry that I read. So, and that's because an instructor decided to include it in the teaching materials, not that it was somehow, it was mandated or utilized widely, probably. So, getting to the politics of it, that's the politics of it. It's controlling, taking control of the structures to be inclusive of, the student body and the community that they're serving.
And that's real hard because they don't let us. There's all these obstacles and how they don't allow these history to be told the way history was
That's
the way it was.
that's the struggle. That's the advocacy.
Margie, what I would say is no se dejen,
Yeah.
peleen,
Mhm.
get organized. No, honestly, I mean, people say I'm a pain in the ass, and I don't really care. I mean, and when I left the presidency in April, who was my vice president? Who did I appoint to be my successor? Diana Lopez. And who did I encourage for her to get as her VP? David Bowles. So I want to keep the momentum rolling, right? And it's now their turn. But it's also about helping each other. It is also, Ruben Degollado said Sergio walks a walk. Well, guess what? I love Ruben Degollado's work. He's in Nepantla Familias, and I got him to teach at Yale, and they loved him. Let me just tell you. And so for me, it is about helping others get into positions of power to get our works and our writing at the forefront of literature. We do not take a second place because I know the literature, and the literature is terrific. And I'm a voracious reader of stuff that's not necessarily Mexican American, and our work stands the test. It's just we need to put ourselves in positions of power to put that literature in front of everybody, and to give it the award that it deserves, and the millions or thousands of copies to be sold. So I don't want to get too animado, because then I might have a little bit of a heart attack, because me pongo muy animado. Because we have to fight. We all have to fight, and this is not about the struggle that ever ends. Honestly, it is never enough in my mind.
I know, because I took a class with Dr. I'm attempting to get a master's degree in Mexican American Studies. And I took a class with Dr. Carmona, and that summer I was mad all summer long because the books he assigned us, they were great books, but they were about everybody, the way Mexicans were treated, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. And I was just like, how did this happen? How do we allow this all summer? I was pissed off because of all of this ugliness towards people of color. And I'm like you said, I get real crazy or I want to fight everybody. And that's kind of why I did this anthology, because I wanted, whenever Donald Trump said all those ugly things about Mexicans, I wanted to fight him. I was like fighting everybody on Facebook, and I was like, this is getting me nowhere. Like, we need to, and I wanted to do something to like just kill those ugly words he was saying about us with beautiful words, and show our culture as beautiful as it is. Like, we're not always the villain. We're not, like, we all have beautiful stories, and we're a beautiful, beautiful culture. And that was real important to me to showcase in this particular anthology, because I got real upset. And so and I think that's what we need. We need people who get upset and who have this passion to change all of this, because I just don't feel it's right, but we that's why we're here.
And we owe it to the next generation.
Yes.
If we're going to be around and matter, we owe it to our sons and daughters and their sons and daughters who are going to come after us. Yes. And they're going to ask, what did you do when you were there?
Right.
Yeah, it's really I'm impressed by the panel, because we're all award-winning, educators in different, whether it's from writing or from teaching or what have you, and we're also have that activist, side to us as well. And that I agree. I mean, we have to fight, like you mentioned, Sergio, about fighting the battles, whether it's not just for the obvious, the writing side, for getting the books on the shelves and in the bookstores, and on the award list, but it's the, encouraging the right people to run for school board, because there's so many local decisions, like you mentioned, Margie, or alluded to, no los dejan, they don't let us, do this in the curriculum or do that. And I know, as a librarian, Margie, you put on those shelves, whatever needs to be there for your students, which is something very admirable. I know that all of us here, have a little bit of rebellion with us, and there's some, going back to a previous comment, there's some badass villains out there that are Latinos, that are real chingones, and chingonas. The hero is not the Texas Ranger, right? The heroes are the Jacinto Treviños and Juan Nepomuceno Cortina and so on. That those stories also need to be told, and that's why we, I'm really impressed by some of the, at least local, rather recent, movements like the retelling of historically accurate, actions of the Texas Rangers, like with
The Injustice Never Leaves You, for example, which is a great book.
The J.T. Canales report. There was the whole rather investigation. There was a whole thing about that. But say that one again.
It's called The Injustice Never Leaves You, which is the terrific historical account of the massacres of the Texas Rangers, Tejano families along the border. And of course, it's published by Harvard University Press. So suddenly in Texas, because it's published by Harvard University Press, se les prendieron el foco and let's pay attention to this book. And then they read the goddamn book and they said, oh my gosh, this is a great book. This is a history we don't know. Yeah. Why don't we know it? And so you need 10 more of those books, and then keep going.
Yeah.
So that's what I do with the novels that I've been working on, the Orinche novels, because like Trini and I grew up hearing the stories of the Texas Rangers, and our families were affected by the violence of the Texas Rangers. And for me, I learned the stories nowhere in the history books, but from my grandparents.
Right.
And I heard them, over the years. And, it wasn't like I was talking about, it wasn't until I got older that, I was also hearing these stories when I was 8 years old. And that didn't realize that they were not in the history books, that these stories were not being passed down. And that's what started me on the path to writing this series about them, and of course I chose to do it in a different fashion. I chose to do it as superhero novels in a lot of ways, but weaving in the histories that the stuff that Refusing to Forget has done, but also the oral histories, the stories that I heard from my grandparents and from the older generations about what happened here. And so when I wrapped it up into the superhero stories, which is a direct response to the Lone Ranger myth, it's taken on its own type of meaning, because I remember when I did a presentation for the first book out in Brownsville, and I did the whole presentation on what happened during the Matanza and everything. And at the end of it, there was a student who came up to me and said, he asked me if I ever heard of Aniceto Pazania. And I told him I had, and he said that was my great-great-grandfather. And since that time, Aniceto Pazania was a rich landowner who had his lands taken from him, his son was shot, and he became one of the leaders of the revolutionary movement, Plan de San Diego. But when that happened, they lost everything. And he said since that time, he's the first one to be going to college. And since that, so the fact that these stories still resonate with the communities and to the people, the fact that they're hearing, he's been able to see his great grandfather's stories in these books does a lot for the community. There's being represented that way, having their stories told is part of the reason, and also in the way we doing it in a different context, right? It's not a historical fiction in the same way that we would look at like Lonesome Dove or something. It is something that is, very much in their minds. Creating a superhero character is, fantastical, but that has an effect in a way where we seek hero characters, when we create heroes like this, because there are a lot of them. They're all in the corridos. Jancito Trevino, Aniceto Pazania, Gregorio Cortez, all the way back to Joaquin Murrieta in California, right? They become this kind of mythical figures. And this is a tradition that we've always had. So all I'm doing is kind of updating it for a superhero, audience. And it's effective. A lot of these kids really like the books, right? So this is important that we tell our stories. And to preserve what happened to us. And then also to have positive influence, to talk about people like Jovita Idad, to talk about people like J.T. Canales who fought, and who we don't talk about it, but they were heroes. And this also needs to be represented as well.
Yeah, anytime I mention in my high school classes, just civil rights, let's talk about civil rights, and they know Martin Luther King, and that's good, and they know maybe Rosa Parks, You know, Emmett Till. I mean, even with the movie, I don't know that they even know that. But you know, I teach 87% Hispanic population. You know, and anytime we mention civil rights, it's just Martin Luther King. They think it's a black and white issue, right? And so they don't know. They don't know our own history. They don't know about the signs that said no Mexicans are dogs. Like when my mom and her family were going to pick cotton, you know, near Houston, or when we were migrants up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, like you know, you alluded to earlier, said like there's different the racisms now, right? Not just from back then, but also now, like you mentioned. I mean, there's kids that are going into dorms these days, airline stewardesses and so on, and different jobs all over the U.S. with NAFTA. I mean, the Mexicans were everywhere. When I was in the Navy, there were very few Mexicans in Philadelphia. People thought it was Puerto Rican or Italian, these big old Jewish nose. But now we're everywhere, you know, and it's really good to see that reflection. On the other hand, you know, there's this so-called Hispanic explosion, right? Every few years, the media announces, "Oh, Latinos are here. We didn't know. You know, here they are." Whether it was back in the 50s with Desi Arnaz, or with the 80s with Gloria Estefan, Miami Sound Machine, or living the vida loca, right? Within the 90s, it's like, oh, there's a Hispanic explosion. Like we've always been here, right? And so Latinos are hot right now in fiction, in literature, in novels, and so we need more Hispanic writers to tell an authentic story. But on the other hand, it's like there's this cultural appropriation where, like, oh, we will make money if there's a Hispanic on the cover, or the title is Hispanic, and so these white authors are telling, like, sometimes really poorly written stories about us. So that's something that certainly we need to work on, and that's why we appreciate, you know, everything that Sergio's done with the Texas Institute of Letters, as well as, you know, like you said, it's about the small battles of naming people to those committees and having those reading lists that have books, Margie, like yours, you know, on there. So that, how do we, I guess, fight that cultural appropriation by, as far as on the writing side?
It's hard. It's a hard battle, because I've served on library, like as a Texas librarian. I was on Texas Library Committee reading list committees, right? Often the only brown girl there, and actually the only person of color on these committee lists, you know, so that's hard. Like we need it. It needs to be everywhere. And whenever we're such a small, like, I guess as in the Texas Library Association, we're a big group. Texas is big. So we have the biggest library association, right? And I remember we were at one meeting, and one of the ladies stood up. She was an African-American lady. She stood up and she said, "I want you to look around this room." We were the people, we were the committee, all the librarians that were on reading committees, right? Those are important committees. And she goes, "Look around the room." And everybody, she goes, "How many people of color do you see in this room?" We were like 3. It was me, her, and like another Black girl. You know, there wasn't a lot of color in the room. And that's where it starts too, for people to appoint us to these important committees and important, like what you've done, Sergio, because that's how we get noticed, you know? And then whenever I published a book, I didn't know this, but, you know, I published a book, and then they were like, "Well, you can't be on reading committees anymore because now it's a conflict of interest." And I was like, "What do you mean? I don't know who, like, I don't read books looking at who the publisher is. I could care less who the publisher is. I read books based on like what the book is about." But it was in the rules that it was against that I couldn't be on reading committee lists anymore committees anymore because I published a book with a major publisher. So I felt like my voice was taken away. I was hurt. I was like, what do I do to fix this? Like, it was just that was devastating to me that I was taken off of these committees because of that, because I really felt like my voice was taken from me. But that's another story.
But on the other hand, Margie, I mean, you know, it does. If you want to get reviewed in the New York Times, you want to get reviewed in the Washington Post. You know, you want to get reviewed in what some people think are the best places. I don't necessarily think that's true, but some, you know, the publishing world, you do have to get published with a major press from New York, and that's the reality. Now, it doesn't mean that Something like Bless Me Ultima will not sell 600,000 or even 1 million copies and be a sleeper hit. But it does matter. And I think, Chicanos have to understand the politics of that. You publish with a smaller press or a more local press, you'll have more control. Your voice will not get squeezed out of you and become white or whatever. But people will judge you immediately simply because you were published by XYZ Press from McAllen, even though the book may actually be better than something published by Hatchet in New York or whatever. And these kind of judgments are made. I mean, of course, nobody told me until, I got my ass kicked all the time, just trying to write the best work and publish it wherever I could. But these are the realities of the publishing world, and I think it is changing only because I think we're becoming more popular, for better or for worse. Right, I was asked to be a judge for the PEN/Faulkner award for fiction a few years ago. I was three national judges, and we read 493 books in about 10 months. That's about 2 books a day, and so and I read hundreds of them. I don't think I read all of them, but one of the things that I noticed, and I told people about this afterwards, with how many Americanos, gringos, if you want to be a little bit more, direct, were writing about the immigrant experience. And why? Because it sells. Because, exactly, no, I think Daniel is absolutely right, el dinero. But that's a part and parcel of the popularity of everything from Mexican food becoming the #1 ethnic food in the country to 19% reaching some sort of numbers, and not all of them, by the way, are liberal, as you know, and it's because we have more PhDs, we have more people with master's degrees, who can now write in the New York Times. Reina Grande was telling me the other day that before she was invited to talk about her book on Oprah had never had a single Latino writer. A lot of African American writers, a lot of gringos, Americanos, but zero, Mexican American, Puerto Riqueño, Dominicano writers in her. And of course, Oprah, immediately you'll sell tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of books. So you have to hold people accountable. It's not that I don't like Oprah. I'm just saying, ask her. And that's what I told Reina. Ask her. What's her problem? Don't be shy. Ask them. Hold them accountable, for God's sake.
Yeah. And you're right. After I remember I was real hurt and upset whenever they told me I couldn't be on my committee anymore. Because I felt that was like my voice, but I felt like, you know what? I'm going to start using my voice like this way, doing what I'm doing now, because I can't do it that way. So it all worked out. And like you said, I'm very grateful to be published with an author from New York, because, the book gets to be in places that I'll never be. Like I saw that it was in a library in Dubai and in Zimbabwe. Like it's in libraries all over the world, and it's in places all over the world where it probably wouldn't have had that same chance if it wasn't published with Penguin. So I'm grateful for all of that. So we're almost out of time. I want to ask you guys something, just a fun question. What's your favorite food? And tell us about it in great detail. And where can we get it? Your favorite food? Anybody? Because I will argue with Sergio that the best.
I can tell you. I have an answer.
Valley.
Oh no! I don't even know if it's Mexican food down there. I mean, it's Mexican food in El Paso. I guarantee you that. La tapatía, chile relleno burrito with frijoles, and I don't know if you know Patty Ginich from Patty's Mexican Table, she has millions of followers. But she wanted to interview me on the border, and I said, let's go to La Tapatía. And La Tapatía has been in Isleta for 40, 50 years. And the interesting thing about La Tapatía, and then I'll be quiet, because the chile relleno burritos are great. They're fantastic. And the tamales, which is what they're known for, are all done from scratch. Everything from la masa to the, whether it's chile de rajas or pork, from scratch. but it is also an emblem of female empowerment. Alicia Chacon, the first woman who was county commissioner of El Paso, and then also became a city councilwoman, she owned La Tapatía. And how did she get her power and her money to run for office and break all sorts of ceilings? Through selling tamales and selling chile relleno burrito. And I mean, there's lines out the door. And so when Pati had it on CBS, and now her niece, Laura, whom I know very well, runs La Tapatía. And so it's sort of continuing, but that's how she got her money to run for citywide office and won. And there's now Alicia Chacon School and all of that in El Paso. So she's quite a history, but it's all through selling fantastic tamales that are always chosen number one in El Paso.
Wow.
So that's my favorite food. That's my go-to place.
I don't know. I grew up obviously in South Texas, right? And we have a lot of different cuisine here. And there's dishes here you can't get anywhere else. So is it, not Mexican as I could say? Well, yes, in the sense that you probably can't get in other parts of Mexico. But Mexican cuisine is very unique and different and regional. And so South Texas food is regional, right? But I think the best places you could get food in South Texas are people's homes and particularly on Sundays and barbecues, right? Yeah. Whether it's going to be tripas, mollejas, cabrito, beef, we eat everything, right?
Yeah, we do.
So I think it's hard to say go to this restaurant, right? And there's so great restaurants down here. Don't get me wrong, but community production of food down here is a constant, right? Especially every Sunday, you can smell the smoke, and weather like this, especially, So I don't have a particular dish because I like them all. But if I had to point one out that if I go to a restaurant really to get, it would be cabrito, right? It's hard to get the cabrito in a lot of other places, especially when I was living in Houston, right?
So I was going to piggyback off of that with Trini. So the cabrito became kind of like a ceremonial type of thing for us. So like when I was leaving from the Valley to San Antonio, my dad went and got a cabrito to barbecue it. And, it's not something you can just pick up at any store. You have to go. He went out there to a lady in the rancho and bought it directly from her. Right. So, I guess you can get in some of the meat markets and stuff, but it's not the same as if you get it from, basically the rancho around here. And, and then of course you barbecue that up for a few hours and it comes out and that becomes kind of this part of our family kind of tradition, right? Like if something special, you get a cabrito and you cook it up because it's not something we do often, right? So that kind of becomes part of the community, right? So in a lot of ways, that's that for me, that's kind of like one of the favorite foods, right? But so I'll pass it on to Daniel there.
Yeah, so I brought show and tell. Okay, this is pan de polvo, and this is a cookie made in China. Oh, I don't know where, but it's like, come on now, there's no competition, right? Pan de polvo, and this is what killed me about COVID is that we didn't have the weddings and the quinceañeras and the pan de polvo with peanuts and little mints and the cabrito from that lady who hasn't opened a store yet, but it's an amazing dish or whatever. But yeah, so my dad's from Jalisco, so I make pozole. I make my own pozole.
That's what I prefer.
Yeah.
No me gustan las panzas.
Yeah, no, I'm not into menudo. It's a Sunday thing, and the Valley Saturday Sunday thing, and it's its own thing, and that's fine. It's good for the cruda, I guess. But menudo is a whole panza thing and beef, whereas pozole could be even vegetarian sometimes. Yeah, it's kind of like the crawfish boil. You just keep adding the spices, and they just keep it cooking for half a month over there for Christmas time in Jalisco. So that's my thing, and that's why I cook what I cook for my family for Christmas dinner. My extended family, we all get together, and the last thing I'll say about food is we need to Austin, Texas. Listen carefully, okay? We need to stop tortilla shaming, okay? Flour tortillas are very Mexican. Corn tortillas are very Mexican. I mean, it's regional, like you all mentioned. Mexico's a huge country. There's all kinds of cooking. the burritos are different in Texas and in McAllen than they are in El Paso. Ours are fried. Yours are Pancho Villa style. I mean, Pancho Villa, they wrapped them for burritos and went and fought the revolution. So they're very authentic things, both. Of course, now we fry ours and stuff like that, but we need to stop, even within our own community, shooting ourselves in the foot as far as Mexican food, Tex-Mex food. There's room for everybody.
Oh, Daniel, I will eat my way through McAllen, no problem. I love it. But I'm just saying, go to it. For example, Elemi, Elemi, in downtown El Paso, the only restaurant in Texas that was a James Beard finalist. And the tacos they make there are like artwork. And it is getting national attention. It was also on, I'm trying to remember that PBS channel. And it's a tiny little place that, the tacos are not expensive, but the guy is just meticulous about the ingredients and the presentation, everything. He's like sort of a nut about his food, but they're delicious. And I'm sure McAllen, in fact, what I want to be invited by you, Daniel, to go eat with you, because I'll do it. I'm all for exploring the regional cuisine.
Yeah. I mean, we can hit up the Pulga, we can hit downtown McAllen and Mission, and hit up maybe a couple spots in Brownsville and Westaco too. So, saludos a todos. Thank you so much, Margie, for having us.
Thank you, guys. Our hour is up, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you all so much for being here today. Y'all have a good afternoon.
Take care. Bye-bye.